Good evening and welcome. On behalf of the Gospel Coalition Australia, it is wonderful to see you all this evening for this special event. My name is Campbell and I serve on the National Council and State Committee for the Gospel Coalition, and I also serve as Senior Pastor at Mentone Baptist Church. It is a joy to call Chris a friend and a brother. I've had the privilege to know Chris and Ali for 9 years, and I have followed his work and writing with a great eagerness and interest and benefit. We're here today to launch Chris's new book, Biblical Critical Theory, How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense. The author of that monumental work, City of God, Augustine, he lived during those turbulent times of the Roman Empire while it was crumbling. Augustine himself was not from the city of Rome, and he was born in a small provincial town in North Africa known as Benghazi. He would later move to Carthage, and he did spend some time in Rome. And yet from that small, tiny, insignificant town in North Africa, his influence would reach Rome, throughout the empire, and indeed even throughout the world today. Perhaps the author here is a bit like Benghazi. Maybe Melbourne is a little bit like Carthage. Biblical critical theory is a comprehensive view of the world through the lens of the Bible. Chris's writing is clear, it is ironic, it is profound. He understands the complexity both of the Bible and of our culture. The work is deeply biblical and culturally masterful. Now, time will tell how wide and important this work will become, but I suggest it is a significant body of thought, and I think you'll do well to read it slowly and carefully and consider it with seriousness. Tonight we have 3 guest speakers with us who are each going to give a short address speaking to the book. Dr. Sarah Irving-Stonebraker is Senior Lecturer of Modern European History at the University of Western Sydney. Welcome. Barney Zwartz is Senior Fellow at the Centre for Public Christianity, and for many years served as the Religions Editor of the Age newspaper. And Dr. Andrew Moody is a Melbourne-based theologian and Editorial Director for the Gospel Coalition Australia. Following each of these 3 talks, there will be a short time for Q&A and a discussion among our speakers. But now I'd like to invite Dr. Christopher Watkin forward and hand over to him. So please give a warm welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Maria, for those kind words. Well, I just need to set one thing straight. Barnsley is nothing like Benghazi. Barnsley, as everybody knows, is God's own country and the centre of all culture. I'm just a little bit sorry that Mary didn't point that out. Thank you, Murray, not only for those kind words, but for organising this whole evening, for liaising with Reformed Theological College. Thank you so much to Susan, Mary's wife, and to Rachel and all the others who have created such amazing food that's been cooked today by hand. Shall we give them a round of applause? Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's been helping to welcome people. Thank you to Matt, manning the book stand there. Thank you to everybody who's been down below, helping people to come up. I'd like to add my thanks to Sarah and Barney and Andrew for agreeing to read through a rather long book and speak about it this evening. Thanks to RTC for hosting us, and my goodness, thank you to you for spending these very precious hours of your time, when I'm sure there are many other very important things you could be doing. Coming here, it's an honour to me. Thank you. I just realised I haven't switched myself. This is a book that took about 7 years to write, but it wasn't always an easy journey. There were many times, and I listened to tell you this, where we didn't think this book would ever get published. And there were many occasions where publishers wanted to transform it out of all recognition in order to get it published. And as we gather here tonight and sort of see the audience that the book is beginning to attract, I can't help but think back to the first moment that I had the idea to write a book like this. You can imagine me as a fresh-faced undergraduate, a relatively new Christian, going up to study in the art faculty of a big secular university, and being very frustrated. And the frustration came from sort of having to exist in two different worlds. On one hand, there was the world of my studies, where every week we were being thrown books by Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, and expected to churn out essays on them. And I remember in particular one unit that I took as an undergrad. It was my favourite unit in my whole time at university, called Modern Critical Theory. And every week we had a new theoretical approach to digest. So we had a week on feminism, we had a week on post-colonialism, a week on Derrida, a week on Foucault, a week on Marx. And it struck me during that unit that all these different critical theories are really trying to do a very similar sort of thing. They're all making certain things out there in the world visible. They're drawing our attention to it. You know, for example, the impression of women in society, or power relations in society. They're making those things visible to us. And they're also making certain things valuable. They're teaching us what to care about and what to condemn in the world as well. But there was another world that I was living in at that time, and it was the world of my church and my Christian Union. And it was a world where we were encouraged and taught to take the Bible seriously, to read it carefully and slowly, and to try and apply it to the whole of life. And as we did that, it struck me that among the many things that the Bible is doing, because the Bible is a book that makes us wise for salvation, words of eternal life, but also another thing that the Bible is doing was acting like one of these critical thinkers. It was making certain things in the world visible. For example, the glory of God in creation. That if the Bible hadn't pointed out, we probably never thought of it. It's making the widows and orphans in society visible. It's saying, pay attention to this, be sensitive to it. And it's also making certain things out there in the world valuable to us. For example, the value of serving other people. But there was no space in my life at the time for these two worlds to meet. Either a physical space or an intellectual space. No table that you could get round and have the Bible join in this conversation that all these theories were trying to sort of have in terms of how to organise society. And I just found that incredibly frustrating at the time. And I thought if I ever did write a book, I probably wanted to write a book that did get that sort of conversation going. Because I thought the Bible has deep and rich, and in today's society, really quite fresh and surprising things to say about these big questions that's been thrown around in this day and age. That no one was paying attention to because everybody thought they already knew what the Bible says. There was no way you could sit down with Rousseau in one hand and Book of Romans in the other and say, let's talk about life, let's talk about human beings, let's talk about life. So that was the book that I wanted to write, but I didn't have the least idea how to go about writing it. And then two things happened. The first is that I got hooked on Bible overviews. It's an addiction. I remember Bible Overviews Anonymous. Sign up for. I remember the first one that I ever did. It's absolutely mind-blowing. So it showed me, I guess what should have been obvious, but I was pretty slow on the take-up, that the Bible is not a sort of grab bag of individual stories. And it's not even the history of a nation. But it's actually, from its first page to its last, a diverse and multi-layered, yet coherent story that makes sense of the whole of life. Not just a story within culture. It claims to be the story of culture, the story that makes sense of everything in the world. And I remember sort of walking into that world, realizing that that's what the Bible's doing. Being something like, and this is sort of my toddler experience coming out of it, like moving from a situation in which you think music is something like a toddler banging a pan with a wooden spoon, arrhythmically, over, over, and over again, for hours. Alison and I, again, will be able to tell you stories. Moving from that is your understanding of music to being invited to a concert by the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, playing Beethoven's Sixth Symphony in beautiful Hamer Hall, which Alison and I had the privilege of attending a few years ago. That the world suddenly gets bigger and richer and more meaningful and more exciting. So that was the first penny that dropped, Bible overviews. The second was my first reading of Augustine's City of God. It's a great sort of lost book. I don't think it's controversial to say it's the most significant work of Christian political and social thought outside the Bible in the 2,000 years of churches. I remember exactly where I was the first time I read it. I was on holiday with my family in the beautiful Yorkshire seaside town of Bridlington. I don't remember distinctly whether it rained all week. Probably a fair bet to say that it did. It usually did when we went on holiday. And therefore there was lots of time to read. And I remember two things about reading the City of God on that holiday. First one was that I understood absolutely nothing. And the second was that the little bits of it that I did understand were electric and paradigm shifting. And the reason that, even though most of it went over my head, I got the sense that there's something incredibly important going on, was that Augustine is taking this Bible overview shape that Christians sometimes talk about in terms of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. It tells the whole story of the Bible. But he does so as a way to respond to the culture. So late Roman culture is accusing Christians of all sorts of bad things in society. Marcellinus, you've got me going on this. But I'll try and repeat. Marcellinus writes Augustine a letter, says, help, everybody's accusing Christians of bad things. Can you write something that will help me? Augustine comes up with this 1,000-page book. Try that. Not what Marcellinus was expecting. But something that has blessed the Christian church ever since. And so he's using this Bible overview structure to speak into culture, not in a way that it always critiques, although he does certainly critique late Roman culture, but in a way that casts a bigger, positive vision for how society could be, a flourishing society, for everybody, not just for Christians. And that's the power that struck me of this book. So I knew from that point what book I wanted to write. And by God's grace, the book is now being written. And my hope and my prayer for the book is really threefold. First of all, I hope that the book might be able to encourage Christians to find a rich biblical way of living in a late modern world and sort of navigating late modern culture and politics. And I think this is perhaps one of the greatest challenges the church faces today. I remember when I was a young Christian, the things that got Christians really sort of going were debates about spiritual gifts and charismatic gifts. It seems a long time ago, that debate now. The things that really seem to animate Christians and cause Christians to fall out with each other these days are questions about how to relate to the culture around us. And you know, some people are telling us Christians need to withdraw and make our own communities and step away from the culture and live separately. And other people recently say, no, what we need is a so-called Christian nationalism, where Christians seek to take the reins of power, perhaps even by force if necessary, and seek to impose a Christian way of living on everybody else. I think the tragedy of those two positions is that they both sell the Bible so short. And I think Augustine gets it. He gets how Christians biblically live in society. And I think he gets it in part from the Apostle Paul in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians 1. Because in that passage, Paul looks around at the different values in society. He says, Greeks, over there, you can be Greeks, you value wisdom. You really prize that. You search for it. You know, if you're thought of as wise, that's you've arrived. He says, you Jews, over here, you look for miraculous signs. You really want manifestations of power. And then he does two things with those observations. And it's the combination of them that's brilliant. So first of all, he says the cross of Christ is the absolute antithesis of what you're searching for. So he says the cross is foolishness to the Greeks. You look at a man hanging, dying and bleeding, a criminal's death on a cross, and you Greeks think that's foolish, that's stupid. And you Jews look at the same thing, and you think that's weak. There's nothing powerful about that. We want power. And so he's drawing a contrast. He's saying this, what I'm telling you about, the Christ I'm telling you about, is not what you think you're looking for. It's the opposite. But then later on in the passage, he goes on to show how that same bloodied Christ on the cross is actually, if the Greeks are willing to get over themselves and look for wisdom in the place they'd least think of finding it, he says that the foolishness of God is actually wiser than human wisdom. If you're really serious about looking for wisdom, you Greeks, you need to come to the cross, because that is where the fullness of wisdom is found. And he does the same for the Jews. And he says, if you're willing to look past your prejudices, you will find on the cross the greatest demonstration of power in the history of the universe. And our cultural criticism, the tragedy of it, is that so often it separates those two. So you've got your antithesis people over here who say the Bible is different to culture. We shouldn't let ourselves be assimilated into the culture. And they're sort of right as far as it goes. And you've got your fulfillment people over here who say, no, we need to show that what people are searching for is actually to be found in Christ. And he is the ultimate fulfillment of their desires. And they're sort of right too. But what Paul shows us in 1 Corinthians 1, and what Augustine shows us in the City of God, is that these two things go together. And a sort of fully biblical way of living in society is both full-on antithesis and all-out fulfillment. Now that, I think, is the genius of Augustine, seeing that in Paul. And that is the God-inspired brilliance of Paul in giving us that model for engagement. So that's what I would love people to discover and find their own ways of living out through this book. My second hope for the book is that it might help to put Christians on the front foot when it comes to speaking in public about our faith. You can be forgiven, can you not, for thinking that the only thing that Christians ever do is defend themselves against all the attacks that are raining down on their heads from the public and the media at the moment. And I think that's just a real shame. It's a shame for Christians, but I think it's also, I might humbly suggest, a shame for society as well. Because the Bible does have fresh, insightful, nuanced, interesting things to contribute to the big questions that are going on in society at the moment. And if we lose that voice in the conversation, then we lose some impression. And so what I'm hoping for this book is it might help Christians to find language and a means of casting a positive vision for society based on biblical principles, rather than always feeling sort of on the defensive. And the final thing that I hope that the book, by God's grace, might be able to achieve is that there might just be one or two fresh-faced undergraduates out there in today's generation who are facing the same frustrations that I was many years ago now, who might find in this book some of the answers that it took me such a long time to arrive at in my own intellectual journey. And that they might see what it's taken me so long to come to, which is that there is such a thing as a biblical, critical thing.
Thanks very much, Chris. Right, I'm going to stand behind the lectern because I've got notes, typical academic lecturer. Thank you all so much for coming and for having me. It's a delight, and it's really also a delight when I arrived this evening to meet so many people who went to church with Chris as well. It's wonderful to have that kind of support from your church family. Well, as Chris mentioned, I've got about 7 minutes, so I'm going to speak fairly briefly, but I'd like to speak about 2 reasons why I think that this book, Biblical Critical Theory, is particularly important and welcome in our current state. The first reason is that the relationship between Christianity and culture in the West has fundamentally changed. Christians are now living in a new cultural moment. In the mid-20th century, there was a famous theologian called H. Richard Niebuhr who wrote a seminal study entitled Christ and Culture. What he was trying to do in that study was to think about, and he came up with 5 categories, to conceptualize the relationship between the church or Christ and culture, Christianity and culture. Now, until about the past decade or so, Niebuhr's categories made sense because in Western cultures, Christianity was recognised as having some degree of normative status. What I mean by that is that there was a shared sense that whether or not one personally agreed with Christian theology, there was still a sense that Christian voices held some degree of respect in public debate. A good illustration, in fact, I think I'll take from my own childhood and coming of age, because I remember that in the 1990s and the early 2000s, public intellectuals in Australia, like Tim Costello, were highly respected and listened to in the public sphere, particularly for their ability to sound a kind of prophetic voice in Australia, calling Australians to care for the most vulnerable. Now, I remember this fact, despite the fact that I actually grew up in a very secular home at an atheist home. There was still that sense that Christian public intellectuals had a kind of a respected voice. But I think now that we're moving into a new cultural moment in which the dominant culture sees itself not in dialogue or even in paradox with Christianity, I'm alluding to some of Niebuhr's categories there, but rather having superseded, having revealed Christianity to be nothing but domination and oppression. So this is a culture of highly individualistic self-expression, authenticity, and the relentless critique of power. And yet, this culture unwittingly appropriates various Christian concepts. This is something that Chris in his book recognises and points out. Concepts like equality and human dignity, life and freedom, expunging them of their theology and distorting them in various ways for their own ends. And moreover, it's highly moralistic in doing so, such that Christians have become, in many ways, to allude to Stephen McAlpine's phrase, the bad guys. So this unique cultural and historical moment, I think, is one of the reasons, and it's my first reason tonight, why I put it to you that Chris's book is absolutely vital. Because biblical critical theory will equip Christians for a cultural moment for which, largely, they are unprepared. After all, it's not immediately clear how to understand and critique a culture which is highly moralistic, actually, and in fact retains some of the premises that are founded upon Christian presuppositions, while dispensing at the same time with their theology. So we think here, for example, the idea of the equality of human life. So Christians are largely unprepared and ill-equipped for this cultural moment. And so the lamentable state of Christians' historical literacy and biblical literacy and perhaps even general cultural literacy in the history of Western civilization leaves us at times fumbling around when we try to understand and critique culture and then put forward a Christian position which is true to the Bible and yet nuanced and thoughtful in contemporary discussions. Think recently, for example, of some of the difficulties that Christians faced when trying to respond in this way to, say, the Black Lives Matter phenomenon. In short, biblical critical theory equips us to understand this new cultural moment, to see Christian premises and cultural distortions. And because biblical critical theory begins from all the biblical categories, and you'll see this when you open the contents of the book, it also enables us to understand the biblical vision of the heavenly city. So one striking example is the way in which, in his exploration of the idea of creation, for example, Chris unpacks the idea of the gratuity of the creation. So in other words, it's superabundance, the fact that it is a gift. And in the book, Chris does a marvellous job of pointing out how different this is to the all-pervasive market paradigm, which is a kind of alternative way of conceptualising relationships, whose lie is that all things are a kind of economy, an investment, an expectation of earning and give and take. Not so with God. And so now for the second reason. The second reason biblical critical theory, I think, is an outstanding book, is for its depth and breadth and its sheer comprehensiveness, its depth and breadth of intellectual engagement. There are actually few scholars, I think, who would have the sufficient command of theology and of the Bible, as well indeed as the history of Western thought, to write comprehensively and in such depth. And this is pertinent, I think, for a different reason. It's been recognised for some time that the standard of intellectual engagement and intellectual culture among evangelicals is perhaps not where it should be. The historian Mark Noll's famous work, and Mark Noll is an evangelical himself, he wrote a famous work called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he identified this situation, this is back in 1994. And the way he put it was the church had failed to define its intellectual responsibilities as God's people in compelling terms. So for Noll, the scandal of the evangelical mind was that there was not one. But listen to this. Here's how Mark Noll described what needed to be done, and consider then how biblical critical theory actually responds to this. Noll argued, and I quote him here briefly, we need to think within a specifically Christian framework across the whole spectrum of modern learning, including economics and political science, literary criticism and imaginative writing, historical writing and philosophical studies, linguistics and the history of science, social theory and the arts. So this is actually, biblical critical theory is answering precisely this problem. And I think academic Christians, and I think Chris tonight has asked me to speak sort of from an academic perspective in particular, and I think that academic Christians have a particular responsibility to lead the way in helping to create a vibrant intellectual culture, reading and learning among Christians. This is something that I'm particularly aware of, not only because I am an academic, but also because I have conversations with highly intelligent university students who are desperate to deepen their intellectual engagement with their faith. And yet sometimes in the broader Christian culture, the prevailing wisdom is sometimes that the only book they really need to read is the Bible. So in sum, this is the second reason why I think biblical critical theory is so important. Academic Christians will find this book enormously illuminating, but it is also a book that I can and will be able to give to my 18-year-old friend, someone I was referring to there, who wants to engage far more deeply with her faith. And actually even Chris, when he spoke a few moments ago, when he talked about the fresh-faced undergraduates, well, she's one of them, and I know more. And so I think here's where Chris's breadth of learning comes in. He explores biblical doctrines and is able to compare them to competing views of the same broad truth. One of the most brilliant examples, I think, is his discussion of the Trinity, a subject which is, of course, notoriously difficult to talk about. But Chris is able to compare this doctrine to other metaphysical theories, from pre-Socratic theories of ultimate reality to those of quantum physics, and then to use that context to actually reveal how unique and how compellingly beautiful is the Trinitarian idea of original reality as personal, that is, of God's specific personality. In other examples that struck me, Chris also does a brilliant job of crystallising the secularisation of the idea of the covenant in the Bible to contract in political theory, which is a central development that helps shape modern cultures, modern political cultures. His summary of Sartre and Camus, particularly in terms of their ideas of autonomy and freedom, which even if we're not aware at the moment of Sartre and Camus' work, their ideas have so shaped the way we think today about being our authentic selves and so forth. His descriptions, his elucidations of their theory is spot on. Christians, particularly Protestants, need this kind of cultural literacy, this kind of intellectual and biblical literacy. So in sum, that's very briefly why I'm genuinely excited about biblical critical theory. I want to see this book read by scholars and by lay people I would like to see also a version of the book one day specifically to equip Christian schools and teachers, perhaps homeschoolers as well. This is a book which illumines the truth. It equips the saints. Chris, congratulations on a book which, for its breadth of learning and ability to speak into the culture, is a model of Christian scholarship.
Forgive me, I'm going to read this because I am a terrible speaker. If I'm not paying attention, I just mumble straight down into my beard. Seeing as I'm up here, it's probably better if you can hear me. I'm privileged to be here tonight, launching biblical critical theory, because this is a remarkable book. It is a profound contribution to 21st century theology and apologetics. Just like Sarah has already said, I am highly impressed by the breadth and depth Chris achieves. His ambition, his erudition, his ability to find striking and helpful illustrations to cut through and make highly complex subjects accessible. He writes with authority about theology, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, atheism, science, metaphysics, epistemology, and aesthetics, among many others. And all this is from the proper theological perspective, which is to say, reformed. In fact, and this is high praise indeed, I think it can serve in its more specialised field as a parallel to Tom Holland's book Dominion, the new book I have most admired recently. I reviewed that book for The Age. I'm going to contact my good friend Jason Sneager and see if it's possible to review this book as well. I'm not sure about the name biblical critical theology, biblical critical theory. Any book with critical theory in its title, it does not sound succulent or appetizing. But this is certainly a highly contemporary term, and Chris sets it properly against the many other forms of critical theory dominating academia right now. Some 30 years ago, I began a PhD at Melbourne University entitled Cornelius Van Til and the Limits of Philosophy, and soon meandered more into moral philosophy, an interest of mine with which my supervisor was more aligned. But alas, life circumstances intervened and I never finished it. So, because Van Til is in my comfort zone, and also clearly in Chris's comfort zone, I want to talk mostly about Chris's discussion of worldview. A worldview is the lens, not that we look at, but that we look through to see everything else, or everything. Chris rightly describes how, until relatively recently, Christianity provided the overarching lens through which we all thought to discover reality. C.S. Lewis described this beautifully, by the way. He said, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything." But the transformation of the centuries-long rise of secular materialism has made Christianity just one lens among many, all seen today as optional, and most as more legitimate than the Christian one. Instead of the overarching framework, it has become one choice among many, and others such as science or psychology are more popular, and secularists regard the Christian one as incoherent. Too many Christians concede these presuppositions and try to engage secularists from within those inadequate frameworks instead, as Chris encourages and exhorts, through the whole broad biblical lens. Melbourne philosopher Ray Gaita has written about the uselessness of the philosopher's God, who can be described by a list of attributes A to N, and who knows my telephone number. Chris, in his different way, also dismembers this impersonal account, which so often dominates discussion. Time and time again, Chris points out divisive arguments in which each pole has a point, but both have overlooked the special insights that the Bible opens. So our biblical lens is not just epistemological. Believers too must remember that Christianity is not just a set of propositions to which we assent. Religious faith is more than just a series of cognitive claims about God and the ultimate nature of reality. Instead, as Chris puts it so beautifully, we have a true story of the whole universe, a true tale of love, loss, promise, and costly rescue, in which we all play a role. We have a way of seeing and experiencing life that can completely transform who we are, how we relate to others and to our world, and what we make of ourselves. Of course, our task is not to condemn the culture around us, as I've already said, nor to approve it, but to examine it through biblical lens. As Chris says, what is required is a patient, compassionate, open-eyed engagement with culture that sees culture's flourishing. He also notes that we must assume, unless and until proven otherwise, that those who have helped build it are also seeking the good as they understand it. That generosity is often lacking in modern discourse. Chris says a number of times that nothing he says is necessarily new. I can't know whether that is so, because of the breadth so exceeds my own. He states two aims. The first is to present ideas that are often overlooked or misunderstood so that Christians can extend the way that they engage with wider cultures. The second is to join many different discussions that might seem disparate and fragmented so that they present a coherent whole. In highlighting the truth, beauty, and goodness of Christianity as presented in the Bible, Chris has made an outstanding contribution. Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to you, Chris, for inviting me to come and to read your book firstly, and giving me bragging rights to be an early reader. I feel a bit of a fraud being here, but I'll accept it. Let me tell you about two challenges I encounter when I teach theology or do my work as a Christian editor. The first challenge is convincing people that sometimes things that seem hard to reconcile can both be true at the same time. God can be completely beyond our understanding, and we can know him and have a relationship with him. Christians can care about people's ordinary physical needs and be concerned about their need to be saved. God can love sinners more than we can possibly imagine and regard them as objects of wrath. Not everybody likes this sort of thing. For some people, both and just means illogical and contradictory. It has to be love or wrath, knowledge or ignorance, or practical or gospel. I've had some students get frustrated and withdraw. I've seen some writers take their opinions to more polarised platforms. But for those willing to stick with it, there's a second challenge: understanding how those two things can be true. It's not enough, for example, to simply affirm that God is sovereign and humans have responsibility. If we leave it there, it might just be a contradiction after all. We have to be able to talk about how the two truths relate structurally. We have to find a way to frame these ideas so we can say something about the relationship between them. And doing this is really difficult. And talking about the general principle is even more difficult. For about 5 years, I've been trying to write an article that was going to be called Both and But, talking about the challenges that I've just described. Two things can both be true, but they might not be true in the same way. Two things can both be true, but they might not be true on the same level. Well, I don't think I'll be writing that article now, because it turns out that while I was mucking around trying unsuccessfully to shape a vaguely informed blog post with a few examples, Chris Watkin was busy writing a 600-page magnum opus, dozens and dozens of case studies that does everything I was trying to do and a whole lot more and does it much better. Let me tell you some of the reasons why this is so good. The first great strength of biblical critical theory is the way Chris uses biblical theology as his starting point. Although he does a lot of cultural appreciation and critique, he doesn't begin there. Although he does a lot of philosophical reflection, he doesn't begin there. Although he engages with a great many theologians, especially Augustine, he doesn't begin there either. Instead, he begins with the story and themes of the Bible itself. He makes his way from Genesis to Revelation, summarizing the realities described there and showing how the thick truths of Scripture differ from the thin gruel, get used to hearing that term, of the alternatives. And that's as it should be, given Christian premises. If Christianity is true, then it will be God's reality and his words about that reality that should be our starting point. Human alternatives, even if they are partly right, will only ever be, to use Chris's words, reductive and partial simplifications of a more complex biblical position. Christian truth will be the horse we keep falling off. I'll come back to that in a moment. Meanwhile, using the Bible as his structuring source also helps Chris to meet the second challenge that I described above. That is showing how the apparently warring ideas can both be true. As Chris presents it, and is able to present it because of his form, such truths are implotted and asymmetric. That is, they have to be understood according to their place and importance in the story of the Bible. This is exactly the kind of nuance we need, and the very thing that is so lacking in many students and writers. The biblical critical theory does a whole lot more than simply stay true to Christian premises and provide a great methodology, though it does both of those. As Chris works his way through the Bible and through Western thought and culture, it becomes harder and harder to resist one of his basic theses, that every non-Christian idea is a cockeyed attempt to shoot at the good reality described in the Bible. Our tendency to treat humans as gods or beasts are both failures to understand what it means to be made in the image of God. All our different attempts to track evil to this source or that group or that structure arise from a failure to understand the universal problem of sin and the persistence of grace. The ancient dichotomy of reason versus passion reflects an ignorance of the personal God who is the source of all that is true and beautiful. And so on. 600 pages of it. Biblical critical theory is as exhaustive as it is full of insight. As Chris Watkin takes it through Scripture, he also reads culture both broadly and closely, appreciating its strengths, faithfully reproducing its shibboleths, and deconstructing its self-serving narratives. I especially appreciate the chapters toward the end where he shows how the be-yourself doctrines about the current time are themselves products of conformity and the market, noting if we go our own way in our society, can anyone still think that it is their own idea? The truth is that we are being sold our individuality, our uniqueness. The market presents us a carefully curated and, in truth, very conservative and restricted portfolio of monetizable identity options. As Watkin skewers the left and the right, the ancient and the postmodern. And as his case studies accumulate, so does the apologetic value of the book. It's like observing the groupings left by a gang of drunken sharpshooters. Their shots all go astray, but once we have enough of them, we can begin to see the shape of the target they all keep missing. Biblical critical theory does a great job of both describing the target and accounting for the misfires. In his book Orthodoxy, G.H. Eston describes his coming to faith and how it involved the puzzling observation that Christianity was attacked for contradictory reasons by different critics. Christianity was too pessimistic. It was a great deal too optimistic. Christianity was an attempt to make a man too much like a sheep. Christianity, it seemed, was the mother of wars. One rationalist had hardly done calling Christianity a nightmare before another began to call it a fool's paradise. For Chesterton, the proliferation of such dichotomies gradually led to the slow and awful impression that Christianity was the norm against which everything else was reacting. Biblical Christianity was true and good. Other views were aberrations, slight or major. Realization was fundamental to his journey from agnosticism to belief. Well, Chris Watkin's biblical critical theory provides the detail that Chesterton's account summarizes. May it serve the same end for a new generation of Chestertons. I think it's well suited to the task.